Yoshinori Ueda killed 5 people with an injectable muscle relaxant and buried their bodies beneath the farmland where he ran a dog breeding business. The victims had not been dragged there from the street. Some came because they wanted dog training. Others had invested money in Ueda's plans. They arrived believing they were meeting a businessman who could help them. Instead, they entered a trap. The first known killing happened in June 1992. Ueda knew the victim, Hiroshi Sato, an acquaintance in his 20s. According to the court, Ueda injected him with a muscle relaxant obtained from a veterinarian. Afterward, he transported the body to farmland in Shiojiri, Nagano Prefecture, and buried it there. That should have been the end of one crime. It became the beginning of a pattern. Ueda had built his identity around dogs. He presented himself as a trainer and planned to expand a dog breeding operation. He advertised his services and approached people who were already interested in animals. That gave him something more valuable than money. It gave him access. A dog lover did not need to be convinced to speak with him. A potential investor did not need a strange reason to visit his property. Ueda's business created ordinary explanations for extraordinary meetings. Then 4 more people disappeared. Sanpei Fujiwara became connected to Ueda through the dog breeding operation. Fujiwara had invested money in Ueda's plans and later became involved in financial disagreements. Ko Kashiwai was also connected to Ueda through the same business. Sachiko Takahashi met Ueda through a veterinary clinic. She became interested in his dog training plans and reportedly invested approximately 800,000 yen. Nobuko Shiji was another dog lover who became involved with Ueda. She also had financial disputes connected to his failed business plans. Between 1992 and 1993, all 4 disappeared. The cases did not immediately look like one large investigation. Each disappearance carried its own explanation. One person had financial problems. Another had traveled for work. Someone else had gone to discuss dogs, training, or a possible investment. Nothing appeared to connect the victims, except a man who continued presenting himself as a businessman. That separation protected Ueda. When one person disappeared, the event could be treated as an isolated tragedy. When another vanished months later, investigators did not necessarily have enough information to see a larger design. Ueda benefited from the gaps between the cases. He did not need the victims to know one another. He only needed each person to trust him separately. That trust developed through ordinary conversations. He could discuss a dog's behavior with one person, talk about employment with another, and present a business opportunity to someone else. The subjects changed. His position remained the same. He was always the person offering an explanation, a service, or a future plan. That image became particularly important after the first killing. Sato had been the only known victim at that stage. His death could have remained hidden if Ueda had not continued using the same operation to meet more people. Instead of abandoning the property, Ueda kept returning to it. Instead of closing the business, he continued using it as a reason to maintain contact. The farmland was not merely a place where dogs could be trained. It became a private location where Ueda controlled the surroundings and the timing of each meeting. People arrived because they thought they had a reason to be there. That was the danger. The property did not look like a random hiding place. It was connected to Ueda's work, so a visitor could explain their presence without raising immediate suspicion. The victims were not entering an abandoned warehouse or an unknown house. They were visiting a man who claimed to have a functioning plan. That plan was failing. The dog breeding operation required money, equipment, land, and continued investment. Ueda's promises created expectations, but the business did not deliver the success people had been led to anticipate. When investors wanted their money returned, pressure began building around him. A financial dispute can create anger. In Ueda's case, the prosecution argued that it also created motive. Those who demanded answers were no longer useful contacts. They had become threats to the image he was trying to preserve. Fujiwara had placed money into Ueda's plans. Kashiwai had been connected to the operation. Takahashi had reportedly invested a substantial amount after learning about the dog training business. Shiji had her own connection through dogs and the property. Their relationships with Ueda were different, but each connection gave him a reason to meet them. That made the pattern difficult to detect from the outside. There was no single type of victim. There was no obvious public target. The victims were separated by age, occupation, and circumstance. What brought them together was not their personal history. It was Ueda's ability to make himself relevant to each of them. Then the disappearances began creating questions. Families waited for phone calls that never came. Friends tried to understand why someone would leave without warning. Investigators began checking the last known movements of the missing people. As those timelines were rebuilt, the same locations and relationships appeared repeatedly. The dog breeding project was no longer just an unsuccessful business. It had become the common point in a series of vanishings. Police began examining Ueda's financial records, his conversations with the victims, and the movements connected to the training ground. The questions became more direct. Why had all 5 people been connected to him? Why had they disappeared after arranging meetings with him? Why did financial disagreements appear in several of the cases? The answers pointed toward a crime that had been hidden behind business activity. By early 1994, police arrested Ueda on suspicion of kidnapping and murder. At first, he admitted responsibility for 1 death. That confession led investigators to Sachiko Takahashi. After she disappeared, Ueda had reportedly kept her body inside a metal locker for several days. He later moved it in a rented truck to the farm in Nagano. Police recovered the locker and found Takahashi's remains. That discovery transformed the investigation. The case was no longer based only on missing person reports or suspicious financial records. Investigators now had physical evidence connecting Ueda to one of the victims. The farmland became the focus of a much larger search. Ueda eventually confessed to killing 5 people. He later claimed that police had pressured him and argued that his statements had been forced. But investigators continued examining the evidence beyond the confession. The victims had disappeared after contact with Ueda. Their finances led back to his business. Their final known movements placed them on paths connected to him. The remains provided the strongest connection of all. The court concluded that Ueda had used a similar method against the 5 victims. He injected them with a muscle relaxant, transported their bodies, and concealed them in farmland associated with his dog operation. The method was quiet. That mattered. There was no loud weapon to attract attention. No public confrontation had to be explained. The victims could disappear from ordinary places, leaving behind confusion rather than an immediate crime scene. The substance gave Ueda control, without creating the kind of disturbance that might draw witnesses. Once the victims were unconscious or dead, the rest of the process depended on concealment. The property provided that concealment. The business provided the explanation for their presence. Together, those two elements allowed the crimes to remain hidden for months. At trial, Ueda denied the charges. He challenged the reliability of his confession and argued that investigators had pressured him. The defense also disputed his mental condition. The prosecution presented the relationships between Ueda and the victims, the financial disputes, the physical evidence, and the discovery of the remains. The court rejected Ueda's defense. In March 1998, the Osaka District Court sentenced him to death for murdering 5 people and abandoning their bodies. Ueda appealed. In March 2001, the Osaka High Court upheld the death sentence. The court also rejected the argument that Ueda had lacked mental competency. The legal proceedings did not change the central pattern. 5 people had been drawn into the same business network. 5 people had disappeared. Their bodies had been concealed on land connected to the man they had trusted. The most disturbing part of the case is that Ueda did not need to appear openly violent. He did not have to threaten everyone he met. He only had to appear believable long enough for people to accept a meeting. A person who loves dogs may naturally trust someone who seems knowledgeable about animals. An investor may listen to someone who describes an ambitious business. A person looking for work may accept an opportunity that appears informal but promising. Those situations are common. That is what made them useful. Ueda's public identity did not look like a disguise. It looked like a normal occupation. The more ordinary his role appeared, the less suspicious his access became. He could ask questions without seeming intrusive. He could invite people to the property without explaining why they should be cautious. He could discuss money as part of a business arrangement. By the time someone recognized the danger, they may already have been isolated. The case also shows how easily separate disappearances can hide a larger pattern. Investigators do not begin with the answer. They begin with fragments: a missing person, a bank transfer, a last phone call, a witness who remembers a vehicle, a business associate who gives an unusual explanation. Each fragment can seem incomplete on its own. The pattern appears only when the pieces are placed together. In Ueda's case, the links were eventually impossible to ignore. The victims had different reasons for meeting him, but those reasons all led back to the same operation. The dog business had created a chain of contact. The farmland had created a place for concealment. The financial disputes had supplied conflict, and the injections had provided a consistent method. What began as a promise of training, employment, or investment ended beneath the ground. Ueda's plan had depended on people believing that the property represented a future. For the victims, it became the last place they were known to have visited. For investigators, it became the location that connected the entire case. The buried remains gave the missing families answers, but those answers came after years of uncertainty. The victims had not simply vanished. They'd been brought into a situation designed to look ordinary. That is why the case remains so unsettling. The danger was not announced through a visible threat. It arrived through familiarity, a business card, a conversation about a dog, a proposal involving money, an invitation to visit a training ground. Each step appeared smaller than the horror waiting at the end. Yet every step moved the victims closer to Ueda's control. Yoshinori Ueda used dogs to build trust, business promises to create access, and farmland to hide the consequences. But the same operation that helped him approach the victims eventually exposed him. The meetings created records. The investments created evidence. The disappearances created a pattern. And beneath the soil, investigators found what Ueda could not explain away. 5 people entered his world, believing they were meeting a trainer, a businessman, or a potential opportunity. They never returned. The property was meant to represent Ueda's future. Instead, it became the place where his crimes were uncovered. The business was supposed to make him credible. The farmland was supposed to make him invisible. Neither succeeded. Thanks for watching.